In this video, we're going to be talking about Inkscape, an intro to Inkscape, and the theory around it. And this is going to be focused on the new V4 tools. So let's talk about Inkscape, and as an introduction here, what is the outcome? What are we trying to accomplish within Inkscape? Well, first of all, we are going to make a 2D layered file. And it's very important we understand layered in 2D. So that means that everything we're working with is flat. Okay, we're not getting into 3D yet. That's later on in Blender. Everything's going to be two-dimensional at this point. You have to understand this file is going to be layered. There's going to be shapes on top of other layers. And we're going to ultimately use that. These shapes are going to cut through each other. And what these shapes represent are golf-specific aspects of our course. Our tee boxes, our fairways, our greens, our rough, deep rough, water bodies, bunkers. Really, you can use these to represent anything you want. It could be a forested area, it could be a sidewalk, it could be a road, your cart paths, okay? You have a lot of flexibility in what these things represent, but at the end of the day, what you need to understand is they're just two-dimensional shapes, okay? Now, what's this Inkscape file going to be used for? Well, it's going to be used for, first of all, an overlay image later on in Unity for digging our terrain. Okay, so you guys already created your LiDAR, hopefully, if you're watching this. And that LiDAR might not be absolutely perfect. You might need to dig some bunkers out. You might need to dig your creeks. You might need to flatten out your cart paths. But you're not going to be able to exactly tell where they are just using your satellite or how they look. But so we can use that Inkscape file to kind of determine where those things are and determine whether we need to dig those things out. That's number one, what we're going to do with this. The second thing, which is even more important, is we're going to create a three-dimensional mesh in Blender. So you have to understand the difference between a 2D shape and a three-dimensional mesh. A shape is a 2D object, a circle, an oval, right? A three-dimensional object is what we call a mesh. And imagine if it's like you're taking a piece of paper, which is initially two-dimensional, and you're laying it down on something that has shape like a ball, and you wrap that paper around that shape, it becomes three-dimensional, okay? That's what we're gonna do later on in Blender, but for now, for Inkscape, we're just creating our two-dimensional shapes. So, concepts. These Inkscape shapes, they're going to determine in your course the appearance and behavior of the ground in game. It's really important to understand the appearance. What does a sidewalk look like versus a fairway? What does a green look like versus a rough? Right? What does a forested floor look like versus a tee box or a bunker? Okay. What's important to understand is also not only the appearance but the behavior. I think we have about 6 or 7 different behaviors that we can assign to a mesh in the game. You can assign a tee, right? So that tee is how the ball behaves when it's sitting on that particular mesh. It behaves as if it's sitting on a tee. Same thing with bunker. You assign it so it behaves like sand, rough, deep rough, green, semi, okay? So that is a behavior. When the ball lands there, how it's going to roll out, how it's going to bounce, and then if that ball is sitting there and you decide to hit it, how that's going to behave in game, okay? So that's the two things your shapes are going to do. They're going to determine the appearance and the behavior of that area in the game. Now, your shape or your shape order, your hierarchy is extremely important in Inkscape. Things on top will cut through things on the bottom. And this will make more sense later on when I show you this thing, but it's really important that if some shapes have to be all the way in the top, and if some shape is all the way in the bottom, it's going to get cut by all shapes above them. It's pretty intuitive once you see it, okay? You can organize your shapes anywhere you want inside of Inkscape, whatever helps you. You can organize them. I like to organize them by putting them into folders or what I call holes. You can rename them anything you want. That's actually something that's different in V4. Before you could not rename your shapes, but now you can. Some of the more experienced builders, they don't put any folders, any shapes. They do everything in what I call flat hierarchy. I personally don't like to do that. It makes troubleshooting more difficult, but the guys that do that are typically the guys that are cranking out a couple courses a week, okay? And they're just working on speed, so organization isn't key, and they've done this a long time. I wouldn't recommend doing that. I would recommend organizing. I'm gonna show you how I do that. Hole 98 and hole 99, okay? These are concepts. Hole 98 is an old concept. It's not used anymore. Don't worry about it. You might see some guys referring to it. Hole 98 used to just be all the stuff that was on the very top, okay, that cut through everything underneath it. It's kind of irrelevant at this point. Some people might use the term, but just remember, just if someone says hole 98, it just means that everything that's on the very top of the hierarchy. Hole 99 is optional, but I would highly recommend it for new builders. It's going to make things a lot easier later on, and we're going to talk about what that hole 99 here is in a second. So more concepts. Hole 98, 99. Hole 90 is an old concept. I just talked about that. Hole 99 is a special shape, and it's a special, what we call color. More on colors in a little bit. But essentially, a hole 99, it's going to fill the gaps in between all of our shapes. In other words, if you have a gap between your fairway and your pine straw area, or your green and a bunker, it's going to fill that in. It is a single material, okay, and it has to be, it typically is assigned a rough or deep rough appearance and behavior. Remember, we talked about appearances and behaviors. So rough is an appearance and a behavior, and deep rough is an appearance and a behavior. They just happen to be the same. Automatically broken up later on in Blender. So in other words, when we create this 99, it is broken up later on. So you have this big shape, and it gets broken up for performance reasons later on. And I'm going to show you what that looks like here in a second in Blender. Hole 99, again, is optional, but I highly recommend it for new builders. No shapes can pass over its perimeter, which means that it must encompass everything in your Inkscape. Okay. We also have this concept of an outer perimeter, or what we call an auto 99. Okay, so a hole 99 just talked about is something you create. If you do not create that, there's going to be a thing called an auto 99 that is done inside of Blender. It's not done in Inkscape, it's done later on in Blender. I'll show you this in a second. Fills in the rest of your terrain. So anything you don't cover by hole 99 outside of the area, and we talked about a terrain, so you created your terrain already, it's that square area. That's going to cover that because we need to cover that in a mesh. So that's what the outer is going to cover up. It again is automatically broken up in Blender. We're going to take a look and see what that looks like. It is a single material. Typically, it's going to be deep rough. I would recommend you just doing deep rough for that. And it's typically, its appearance is given the satellite images you created. Typically, you assign that satellite image to it. So it's just going to take your sat image as what it looks like in game because it's so far away from the golfer. It's fine just to put a sat image on it. That's what I would recommend. There are some other things you can do, but I would recommend put your sat image on there. And it is automatically added later on the Blender process. You won't see it in Inkscape, but I'll show you kind of where it'll end up showing up. So let's show you here kind of, this is really far ahead at this point, but this is Blender, okay? This is after I've cut my shapes. I've already done the Inkscape, and I know you haven't seen Blender yet, but it's going to give you an idea of what the outcome of Inkscape is. So you can pretty easy to tell in here. I've got things like this area right here. This is like a cement parking lot of some buildings surrounding my course, you see here. So there'll be some buildings in here. This is kind of the perimeter of my course. And then you can see in here, obviously, you got things like fairways, okay? I've got tees, I've got greens. The gray, like I said, is asphalt areas. I've got some big wooded areas over here. What's important to understand here, though, is this green piece circling right here. This is my hole 99. And remember what I said, my hole 99 has to encompass all of the shapes that I created. So you can see it gets close here, but it is outside of it, okay, on this side right here. And then circles it all the way around, and nothing from the shapes that I created in Inkscape overlap with the outer perimeter of this, okay? So remember that rule. Now this outer piece to this auto 99 you see out here, this was automatically created by Blender. And you can see, remember I said it's automatically segmented? Because these huge, if this was one giant big segment, it is actually a little bit of a performance hog inside of Unity when we try to run it in game. We want these broken into smaller segments. So you can see as I click in here, this auto 99, which goes around, which covers my terrain. Let me back up here. So this is my terrain. This is what you created. This plot is what you created in your LiDAR processes. This is my inner terrain. My outer terrain is not shown here. Okay, I do not have an outer terrain for this course. If I did, it would be way outside here. But this is my inner terrain. You can see my inner terrain, whatever wasn't covered by my hole 99, which you see, it's that lighter green area here, is then filled back in by my auto 99, my outer perimeter, my outer plot here, okay? So that's pretty much the concept and what things will end up looking like inside of Blender. And then you can also see, just remember that my whole 99, which I said is, this is broken up. You see these chunks I'm highlighting now? These are all chunks of my whole 99. And these chunks, again, even though I created this one big giant loop, it ends up getting divided up inside of the Blender tools for use later on. So let's go back to my presentation, if I can find it here. And let's go to our next slide and talk about our next concept here, which is the idea of blends. And what are blends? So blends are special meshes, okay, that make the transition between two meshes softer and more natural, okay? So when you look outside and you look at, if you look out your window, a lot of times there's no hard lines in nature. Now you do have hard lines with like man-made stuff like concrete and roads, but when you talk about grasses and when grasses transfer from one type to the next, they're more soft. They're not these hard lines. So how are blends, and I'm going to show you what a blend here in a second, but how are they added? Blends are assigned within Inkscape. So that's why we're talking about those now. Even though they're assigned in Inkscape, you're not going to see them in Inkscape. Okay, you're actually not going to see the actual blend mesh that I'm talking about later on until Blender, but you have to understand how they're assigned in Inkscape in order to see what they're going to look like later on in Blender. So why are they important? It's important to understand what they are and how they're assigned, and that's critical because the shapes and meshes that use blends are impacted in their creation and appearance based on how you set them up in Inkscape. So that was a mouthful, right? But there's going to be times when you might not want blends. There are going to be times when you do want blends, and different types of objects have different kinds of blends. Okay, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about, first of all, what a blend is, okay? So what you see here is I have an area here. Let me turn on my highlighter so you guys can see my mouse a little bit better. There we go. So I have a green area right here, okay? Then I've got what I would call my fringe, or this is actually a fairway area, and then I have a semi-rough, then I have a rough, and then I have a bunker over here. And you can see there's a lot of hard lines here, right? My green from here, you can see there's a hard line right there. And then there's another hard line right here and right here. And this doesn't exactly look natural. And there's also a very hard line right here where my bunker meets my rough area. So if we want to make this look more realistic, what do we need to do? Well, we need to have the slide work correctly. All right, magic of editing, I got that fixed. So what I want you to do is watch these hard lines as I bring up a blend here. Now, you can see how much better that fades in between the green to this fairway, fairway to semi. Let me go back and forth through here. So see how much smoother that transition is. And also look at the bunker over here. See how the lip is much more transitioned. Now the inner lip isn't actually finished on this one, but you get the idea of how much more natural this looks. So what are the actual blends? So this is with those blends highlighted. These are actually 12 centimeters wide, okay? So I've got a blend that actually blends this material here to this material here, and then this material here to this material here is in this blend. Same thing with this outer one. I've got a blend here, and then I've got a blend on this side as well. So do you get the idea of what a blend is? So those blends are assigned in Inkscape. So what are some blend rules here and things you need to know? Well, different Inkscape colors have different blend properties. And you're wondering at this point, well, what's an Inkscape color? I'm going to show you that in a second. So some Inkscape colors have no blends. In other words, there might not be that little region I just showed you between two shapes. There might not be a blend there at all. That's what we call a hard edge. The different properties are also the blend width. Most of the time it's 12 centimeters, but there's actually cases where there's some insets that are a little bit differently. So I'm going to talk about insets here as well. So some things here, the outer perimeter, remember that Auto 99 that goes around the very outside, around all the way to the edge of the train, that has no blend no matter what material you choose, okay? So if your outer 99 is auto, if you decide to assign it a deep rough, which you do before you submit to Blender later on, you do not do that in Inkscape. it doesn't matter. It will not have a blend. But that's not important because typically you're not going to see that perimeter. It's far away from the golfer. The deep rough and rough have no blend. You're typically going to blend into those. So you would blend into deep rough from, for example, a fairway. But typically you're going to blend into those, but they do not have a blend themselves. Most shapes have a 12 centimeter blend. We'll talk about that in a second. Some shapes have an inset, namely bunkers and lakes. So what's special about those is with those insets, they must be on top. So bunkers and lakes have to be on top of all other shapes. You cannot cut through them. Right? Do not cut through or do not attempt to cut through bunkers and lakes. You will have a problem later on in Blender when you do that cut. They are very sensitive to sharp corners, okay, and Inkscape mishaps like double nodes or cusp nodes that are like sharp corners. So in other words, when you go to cut, you might get cut errors because your bunkers and lakes have sharp corners. So do not attempt to have sharp corners. So here's an idea. Here's another view of, this is what we call, this is actually a bunker. And what I'm trying to show you here is this area right here is what we call our outer blend of the bunker. So this is between the bunker and the rough. And then there's actually an inner blend. Now there's no orange line showing it, but from this line here to right about here, there's a second blend. That's what we call the inset, okay? Because bunkers will have one blend on the outside and then another blend on the inside, okay, which blends the lip to the sand. I don't have a picture of it, but it's the same thing with lakes. On the lakes, you're going to have the outside of the lake that's going to blend into something like a fairway or most likely a rough. And then on the inside, you're going to have the lake base, okay, which is going to be the like lip of the lake or the bank of the lake and how that blends into like the muddy part or where the water meets there. So that's the important thing to understand is that bunkers and lakes have insets. You cannot cut through a bunker or lake. And typically you always are going to have that bunker or lake on top anyway. It really doesn't make sense for something to cut through a bunker or a lake. So some Inkscape rules. Actually, before I show you the rules, let's show you an Inkscape folder so you guys can start to see some of these concepts in use. So this is a pretty much an almost completed Inkscape file. And what you're seeing here, this is actually Hershey Country Club. It's two courses, okay, the East and West Club. That's why it looks like there's a lot of holes here. And so what you're seeing is underneath here, this is my SAT image that I created when I did the LiDAR to terrain process. And you can see I can turn that SAT image on and off to give you an idea. Ultimately, that SAT image is just a reference for me as I draw my shapes. So you can see in here, if I zoom in just a tad, let's go into like an area right here that has a few things in it like water, fairways, and such and such. So you can see here I have a cart path, I have some pine straw areas, I've got some fairway, I've got semi-rough, I've got greens, I've got water, I've got bunkers, okay? And over here on my right is my hierarchy. And you can see I've got, this is the order of the hierarchy. So anything all the way up here is on the top. So you can see I have what I call my hole 98. Now, although hole 98, the concept of how use it in the old days in V3 is no longer there, I still like to use that concept. So if I turn off hole 98, it is typically what I'm doing is I'm turning off some shapes that I need to have on the very top of my hierarchy that are going to cut through a bunch of different things, okay? But what I want you to show you here is how when I create these shapes, and later on we're going to create some of these shapes, is how they're assigned and how these blends are assigned. So across the bottom I have my palette, okay, all these different colors. And if I hover over that palette, you can tell, if you see right above here, it says T, so that is what I'm going to assign to my T boxes. And it says it has a blend of 0.12 meters or 12 centimeters. So my T boxes, here's one right here, will have a blend, even though you can't see the blend here, later on it will have a blend of 12 centimeters. And if I go across the bottom, you can see a bunch of these different colors that I can assign. One here is deep rough, which has no blend, as you can see. I've got rough, which is no blend. But then I've got semi-rough, which is a 12 centimeter blend. Fairway, 12 centimeter blend. Green, 12 centimeter blend. Bunker, 12 centimeter blend and an 18 centimeter inset. Remember we talked about insets. So this is how you tell what shapes get blends and what shapes get insets. Pine straw, 12 centimeter blend. Concrete, concrete does get a blend, but later on, if we want that hard edge, we just don't activate the blend. And I know that's kind of a difficult thing to understand, but for concrete, we can actually disable, if you want to call it disable the blend. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Lake, 12 centimeter blend, 18 centimeter inset. Here's a special instance of a creek, okay, which we do not have an inset though, okay? And then some customs that we can use to assign to a variety of things. Keep in mind that what you assigned here in Inkscape does not dictate or force you to use a particular material, okay, or property later on. In other words, I could assign something as a T in Inkscape, and then later on inside of Unity, I can completely change the material and behavior of that, okay? It's important to understand because if you have a particular area and you run out of custom shapes or what you want to do here, don't worry about it, okay? You can assign stuff later on in Unity to your liking. One last thing I want to point out here was this whole 99. So you can see if I'm going to do a whole 99, no blend here, and I also have a custom here, which is also a no blend shape. So let me back out here and let me show you what this is going to look like when I send it off to Blender. Let me just let this refresh. I got a lot going on with this one. So if I come down here, I'm going to turn on my whole 99. Whoops, those are my cart strokes, never mind. So there's my 99. If I turn off my satellite here, you can see what this course is going to look like. So I've got this pink area, which ends up getting converted to my whole 99. I showed you that in Blender a little bit. It ended up being green inside of Blender. And then you can say I got all this empty space on the rest of my terrain, which will get filled in by my auto 99. And you can see right now when I click this whole 99, it's one giant piece. Remember, that gets broken up automatically for us later on inside of Blender. And as I told you before, my auto 99 here on the outside doesn't even exist yet because that gets added automatically later on in Blender as well. And you're going to see later how you select those materials and how they're going to be assigned. So to wrap things up, my Inkscape rules, okay? Remember, do not cut through bunkers and lakes. Remember, your bunkers and lakes have 30 centimeter insets for blending. So keep your bunkers and lakes on top and be careful. They need to be very, very smooth shapes with no Inkscape oddities on them. One thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to merge or union overlapping same color shapes, okay? So if you've got two, let's say, rough areas that are touching, okay? If they're touching, you actually need to union those together, okay? But you need to be careful when you do that because using the union functionality within Inkscape can create some odd nodes in there. So just be aware. I would avoid, if you're new, just draw your shapes in one piece, avoid unioning your shapes together. One thing that will be covered more detail later on is donuts. No donuts. The most common thing that creates a donut is like a cart path. So say you draw a cart path around a hole and it comes back down and it connects back to itself again, you have now created a donut because that cart path has an inside and an outside. Okay, that is a donut, that is a no-no. You can fix that in two different ways. One is to slice it, a little slice through it so it's no longer a complete donut, be more like a C now, or you can punch through them. And I'll cover both of those later on in a subsequent video because they're going to need their own video. Remember that whole 99 must encircle all the shapes. Nothing can pass through the perimeter of it. And pretty much with V4, for the people who have used V3 tools, V4 is pretty much what you see is what you get. So something that's on top is going to cut through what's on the bottom. You can rename your shapes all that you want. You can organize your shapes however you want. And one last thing I forgot to tell you guys about, let me show you here how I organize my shapes. You can see I have all these different folders over here. My hole 54, hole 7, hole 12. These don't necessarily, you can see there's no hole 56 on a golf course. No, you're right, there isn't. That's because There are 36 holes in this course, and I just arbitrarily named them for things that made sense to me. So you can see down here is hole 54, which is this area down here. If I turn it on and off, it was this particular area that I added, okay? So you can rename things anything you want. The most important thing here is the hierarchy. You can even rename every shape that you want, call it a T. I don't, I think it's a big waste of time, but you can absolutely do that if you wish, okay? So that is it for this video. It went a little long, but there's a lot of good theory here, and good luck and onward.